everyone, and thank you for tuning into our talk today, Miniskirts and the Unravelling Rag Trade. And thank you to Melbourne Fashion Week for including us in the program this year. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that the old Treasury building where I'm presenting from today is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Now, before anyone worries, we can't see or hear you. So if you have a question, please place it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical questions, please place them in the chat and I'll do my best to help you. Today, we continue the discussion around our current exhibition, Lost Jobs, the Changing World of Work. And I think we're in for a great one. Pauline Hastings is a PhD candidate in contemporary history at Monash University. Her research into the effects of youth culture in Australia's clothing and textile industry in the mid to late 20th century sits at the intersection of cultural and economic history. Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you very much, Katie, for that lovely introduction. And thank you also to the Old Treasury Building Museum for the invitation to present today, and to Melbourne Fashion Week for the opportunity to tell you about my research into a very dynamic period of Australia's fashion industry history. I'm speaking to you this morning from West Gippsland, from the lands of the Gunai people, and I acknowledge them as traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Welcome to Miniskirts and the Unravelling Rag Trade. What we see here is an image from the past, from 50 years ago in fact, and what is depicted here is something you don't see anymore in Australia. A factory of this scale producing clothes. At around the time this photo was taken in the early 1970s, textile, clothing and footwear manufacture, collectively known as the TCF industry, provided jobs for 165,000 workers nationally. And these were just the ones covered by the official statistics. Many workers flew under the radar. Those working from home were the industry's outworkers and impossible to count in the official figures. One trade union estimated that the number of people outworking at the time could have been as many as 30,000 nationally. TCF industry-wide, 65% of all workers were women, with that number rising sharply to 84% once we isolate the clothing manufacturing sector. You may also have noticed that this image is from a regional factory in Warragul in West Gippsland. This was the factory of Morris C. Dowd Proprietary Limited, a mid to large sized manufacturer of women's fashion apparel. We tend to think of clothing manufacture as a metropolitan phenomenon centred around Flinders Lane. And while the lane was certainly an industry hub, manufacturing also had a firm foothold in country areas. In fact, 30% of all TCF employment was in the regions. So what we appear to be seeing in this image is a representation of an industry in the prime of its life, providing employment for many throughout the state. But we now know that TCF manufacture rapidly disappeared over the course of the following decades. Many historians have delved into the collapse of the industry. Many fingers point to globalisation as the cause, alongside the momentous changes to national policy that heralded restructuring of manufacturing in Australia in general. And blame is often squarely parked on the Whitlam and Hawke government's push towards trade liberalisation throughout the 1970s and 80s. While these national policy changes certainly triggered the implosion of the industry, there's actually more to this story than that. To grasp the industry's true state of health as it took the first kick from the 1973 tariff cuts, we need to look beyond trade policy and delve into what was happening on the inside in the 2 decades leading up to then. Today, we'll travel back in time together to zero in on how the industry came to be scattered throughout regional Victoria, as well as metropolitan Melbourne, how it grappled with widespread labour shortages, and how it went into such rapid decline. For this talk, I'm drawing on archival research for my PhD project and oral history interviews that I've conducted with former rag trade business owners and workers. But firstly, I invite you to journey back with me to the 1960s to look at how youth fashion culture left its indelible imprint on the industry. After this time travelling, I hope that you will have gained a new perspective on how events of earlier decades compromised the health of local clothing manufacture, leaving it weakened and struggling to withstand the pressures from the 1970s onwards. In its 1st of January 1965 New York edition, Vogue announced the arrival of the Youthquake, putting a name to a phenomenon that had swept England and France and had now landed on US shores. Vogue's editor, Diana Vreeland, coined the term Youthquake to describe the power and influence of youth in bringing about social and cultural change. By 1965, this power was evident just in numbers alone. The US population of 190 odd million comprised 90 million from the baby boom generation under the age of 24. Vreeland's editorial spoke to the teenagers in that demographic, calling 13 the new jump-off age and suggesting, gone is the once upon a daydream world. You can already be what you want to be, implying that in the here and now of 1965, the stuff of teenage daydreams was already within the grasp of the young, thanks to the Youthquake. However, back on Australian shores, the baby boom generation was only beginning to telegraph its might. Some of you would be familiar with these scenes from June 1964 as the Beatles toured Australia, the first major display of mainstream teenage might that had been witnessed here. Up to this point, the separate life stage between childhood and becoming an adult had not gained much recognition here. Teenager was a term that Australia was still coming to terms with. Therefore, the ripple effect of the Youthquake sweeping the Northern Hemisphere had been given little attention in Australian ready-to-wear fashion markets till then. Fashion aimed at teenage girls was still modelled on similar styles to those worn by their mothers and older women. Even the Australian Women's Weekly teen focus lift-out called Teenagers Weekly showed styles that were just smaller versions of the adult fashion appearing on the main pages of the magazine. Mainstream Australian fashion clung steadfastly to influences from the rich and the royal, as well as the dictates of Paris couture, largely ignoring what was happening on the fashion fringe. Home sewing was one way for creative youngsters to get the latest looks seen in overseas fashion magazines. But for those who lacked the skills to design and or sew their own clothes, they were faced with slim pickings in the ready-to-wear market. As a result, it was sometimes difficult to differentiate the young from the more mature women due to their similarity of dress. This is illustrated here in the image of 19-year-old Margaret Wood in her winning ensemble for the 1962 Fashions on the Field competition. Margaret won the section for outfits under £30 and poses outside her North Essendon home beside her new Ford Falcon, the prize for winning the competition. In the image on the right, we can see Margaret again alongside the other section winners of the day, another 19-year-old, Jeanette Forsyth of Hawthorn Centre, and far right, Mrs. Thais Muir of Caulfield, a matron of undisclosed age. Style-wise, all three women look remarkably alike, despite the age similarity. Also, an image of my extended family, dressed up for a wedding in Warrnambool in 1964. My older sister Susan had just turned 14 at the time, and you can see her in the front row, far left. Even though her dress is not as formal as those worn by my mother and my aunts, it's still a mature style, made more so by the accessories that were de rigueur of the day. Here, her hat, gloves and necklace age her beyond her 14 years, and I believe she was even having an early taste of wearing stockings and suspenders. And in case you're wondering, I'm the sulky little poppet on the far right, loathing having to wear that hat. In May 1964, a pillar of Australia's textile industry and the founding director of Prestige Limited, George Folletta, told the Sydney Morning Herald that, quote, "The world is younging, youth is taking over, and new developing economies will call the tune." George Folletta's prediction of the world's younging preceded Vogue's declaration of the Youthquake and the arrival of the Beatles. In conservative Australia of the day, it might have seemed fanciful. But in October 1965, it came to pass in spectacular fashion. Swinging London and the Youthquake were dramatically drawn into the Australian spotlight when 22-year-old English photographic model Jean Shrimpton, sponsored by American chemical giant DuPont de Nemours Inc., strode onto the lawns of Flemington Racecourse on Derby Day. What followed is a well-known story. Australian reactions to Jean and her comportment range from outrage to ambivalence, depending upon one's societal position, age, or gender. The older generation was polarised over Jean's double fashion faux pas. Some were scandalised by the shift dress that revealed 4 inches of bared flesh above her knees, and others mortified by potentially the greater of the sins, appearing in the sacrosanct members' enclosure at Flemington, minus the obligatory hat, gloves, and stockings. Quote, "If Miss Shrimpton wants to wear skirts 4 inches above the knees in London, that's her business, but it's not done here," said Lady Nathan, the indignant Lady Mayoress of Melbourne. In her other comments to Melbourne's Sun, Lady Nathan referenced the flouting of the dress codes by calling Jean a bad-mannered child. But notwithstanding the ire of those in the Flemington members' enclosure, many young women were inspired by Jean's freshness, her simplicity of style, and her apparent disregard for the strictures of convention. Young men just liked what they saw. One reporter for the London Evening News describing the vision of Jean amongst the other punters in the members' enclosure as a petunia in an onion patch. This moment in time has since been celebrated as a defining moment in Australia's cultural history, the spark that ignited mainstream youth fashion culture here. By 1965, Australia, like its Northern Hemisphere neighbours, also had a substantial population in the 15 to 24 age bracket. And remember that this was a time of full employment across the board and a time when most Australian youth were in the workforce. Forward-thinking entrepreneurs such as George Folletta from Prestige had astutely recognised the spending power of this group. And so too did retailers such as David Bardis, the managing director of Sportsgirl, the youth retailing arm of parent company Sportscraft. Copies of Shrimpton's Miniskirt appeared swiftly in the windows of Sportsgirl on mannequins within days of Melbourne Cup that year. As the 1960s rolled on, the tsunami of social change that followed the Youthquake gathered momentum. The young with cash to splash were clamouring for more fashion choice in the ready-to-wear market. No longer did they find much to their liking in the ladies' frock departments of the major retailers. They sought affordable fashion, and it needed to be easy care and up to the minute in styling to match their lifestyles. Their weekly pay packets enabled them greater freedoms than those experienced by their parents during the war years. For most, leisure, having fun, and individualising their appearance became the pastimes of youth and consumed the greater proportion of those pay packets. What was happening style-wise in swinging London and other fashion hothouses of the Northern Hemisphere was now on mainstream youth's radar and quickly became the way for 1960s youth to distinguish themselves from the older generation and each other. To be, quote, new, exciting and different was Sportsgirl's slogan, But this catch cry also neatly captured the spirit of the era and what separated young Australians from their elders. The idea of being new, exciting, and different also influenced lifestyle and the outlook of this generation, as well as their speed of consumption of clothing. Shopping itself became a pastime, and the quest for novelty pressured the production and traditional two-season delivery of ready-to-wear fashion. The youth-led segmentation of the fashion market forced changes to garment production. The two-season or 6-monthly cycle of range delivery was the model whereby summer ranges appeared at the end of winter and winter ranges were in the shops in February. It had been the traditional way of operating, and it meant that manufacturers could forward plan. It gave time to devise or copy new ranges, order textiles, plan production schedules, etc., and thereby achieve some advantages from economies of scale. But this cycle became insufficient to satisfy the transitory nature of youth fashion whimsy. Speedy fashion turnover in stores enticed customers to return with frequency. Greater frequency was needed to sustain impetus in a changing marketplace and to separate the young from their money. Before implementing a vertical structure model that saw garments made in-house exclusively for retailers, Sportsgirl experimented with rapid response ranges on a weekly cycle, introduced on Mondays, with more of the better sellers reproduced by small maker-uppers in and around the CBD for restocking later in the week. Young local designers such as Prue Acton supplemented this fast turnaround of department store stock by working at a lightning pace in nearby Flinders Lane. Collectively, this dialed up the pressure on large manufacturers by conditioning the consumer to want smaller and seemingly more exclusive quantities of multiple new coordinating styles delivered at turbocharged speed. Not only was the market segmenting between mature and young styles, the speed of fashion obsolescence and the uptake of coordinates meant that the market was subdividing even further. To satisfy an increasingly segmenting market, small runs of garments and other cool gear produced without economies of scale often superseded what had been profitably manufactured in fewer but larger runs. According to Mary Quant, you needed to be, quote, right for the times, a little ahead of the times, but not too much. However, for volume manufacturers with their large workforces, putting this advice into practice was easier said than done. As a result, many manufacturers just stuck to what they knew best and didn't even attempt to accommodate the youth fashion scene. Let's return to the factory floor of Morris C. Dowd to look at how some manufacturers negotiated the forces of the segmenting fashion market of the 1960s. Dowd's maintained core production work of a stable product. In their case, it was hickory foundation garments, while embracing the call of the changing market. Their conveyor system of production enabled various garment lines to be manufactured simultaneously, permitting them to diversify and accept contract work in making up swimwear for designers such as Kenneth Pirrie and other companies without these resources. For example, when Gold Coast designer Paula Stafford's workroom could not keep up with the demand for her reversible Swiss cotton bikinis in the early 60s, Dowd stepped in to cut, make and trim this swimwear, a perfect fit for a company set up for the precision manufacture of bras. What followed in the early 70s was the launch of the company's own fashion outerwear label, known as the Clothing Company. This saw the production of outerwear completely take the place of hickory. In line with the changes occurring in outerwear fashion markets, hickory sales had already been falling as traditional foundation garments lost market share to new players who had started producing underwear designed to complement the latest fashion outerwear. Manufacturing under contract for others still continued, and over the next 2 decades, many volume fashion labels such as Country Road and Esprit and the ever-popular Jag jeans, designed by Adele and Rob Palmer, were also made in the Warrigal factory. Through my research into the larger story of how youth culture interacted with the economy, I've identified other factors on the supply side of the equation that had been progressively eroding the foundations of the fashion industry. Since the 1940s, the geographic spread of the industry itself had been changing as decentralisation became the buzzword of the post-war recovery. With the promise of an untapped labour supply in country towns, manufacturers had been financially incentivised through state and local government programs to set up new factories or relocate existing facilities into regional areas. Providing jobs to boost country towns and to stop the drift of the young to the cities was the rationale. Cash assistance, cheap loans, cheap leases on council-owned buildings, subsidised transport and telecommunications, payroll tax rebates were just some of the perks that had the same effect as autumn rains on dry paddocks. Clothing factories sprang up like mushrooms from Warrigal to Warrnambool, Wonthaggi to Wangaratta, Morwell to Mildura, and everywhere in between. Decentralisation programs normalised this proliferation of factories outside a 50-mile or 80-kilometre radius of Melbourne. But its negative effect was to fragment the industry itself into smaller units. This, in the long term, prevented the industry from consolidating and rationalising into a viable and solid position that might have seen companies able to withstand the push from overseas interests later. Financial handouts and the promise of an untapped labour supply, together with the buoyancy of the youth-driven fashion market, quite understandably dominated the thinking of manufacturers in the 1960s. And it allowed them to sleepwalk into the problems that would eventually jeopardise their long-term sustainability. But in the short term, fragmenting the industry into smaller production units seemed to work in concert with the forces of the segmenting fashion market that called for smaller but plentiful runs of garments. So with the volume of cashed-up Australian youth demanding more fashion choice, and Australia still enjoying the tail end of the post-war economic boom, it was not unreasonable to expect the manufacturing industry to rise to the occasion, make a killing and be the stronger for it. On the simple face value of the economic principle of supply and demand, the unravelling of the industry in this climate makes little sense. But one more factor was at play here, further complicating our story. Chronic labour supply issues prevailed in spite of Australia's robust immigration program. And moving to the country via decentralisation programs promised to help, but unfortunately didn't do a lot overall to solve the problem. Let's return to Morris C. Dowd Proprietary Limited and take a closer look. By 1965, Dowd's had already factories throughout Melbourne and beyond, in Collingwood, St Kilda, Balaclava, Brighton and Hillsville. Taking advantage of state and local government decentralisation incentives, Dowd's commenced making hickory foundation garments in temporary council-owned premises in Warrigal with 36 machinists, while a purpose-built factory was constructed nearby. By the end of the decade, women's outerwear had become the company's focus, and most operations relocated to the new Warrigal plant. Staff numbers grew to 200 at one stage. Former Dowd's director, Michael Talbot, spoke glowingly of the loyalty and diligence of his Warrigal staff, who were initially mostly the daughters of and wives of dairy farmers. In Michael's opinion, country people were the best in the world to employ. But despite their quality, quantity was always a problem, and decentralisation did not deliver the expected panacea. Michael admitted that they were always short on labour, even though companies like Dowd's went the extra mile to recruit staff and retain them. For Dowd's, morale-boosting activities were a feature on the company calendar. Sporting and social events such as netball competitions, exercise classes, card nights, staff picnics, balls, and fashion parades, etc. On a day-to-day basis, they insisted on regular movement breaks aimed at preventing repetitive strain injury. And at one stage, a company bus was run to widen the net to secure workers, providing transport to and from the factory for workers from towns further afield. My research into two other companies that decentralised in the immediate post-war years shows that these companies faced similar problems. Labour shortages were reported in regional newspapers in relation to textile and hosiery company Prestige Limited that decentralised to Horsham in 1949, as well as for Latoufe and Khalil's factory in Benalla from 1946. Both companies also continued to operate out of various Melbourne suburbs, but both couldn't resist the opportunity to expand into the countryside. Latoufe and Khalil operated at the budget end of clothing manufacture, with G.J. Coles as one of their largest companies, or clients rather. This company struggled to maintain full staffing levels in Benalla, but was delivered a windfall when the Benalla migrant camp opened nearby in 1949. This was a holding facility for new arrivals to Australia, particularly women and their children who were separated from breadwinning partners for various reasons. However, when the camp closed in 1967 and its main source of labour had dried up, Latoufe and Khalil left Benalla shortly thereafter. Industry-wide, it was commonplace to see permanent signage affixed to factory walls and fences to attract staff. This Latoufe and Khalil photo from one of their metropolitan factories dates from the 1950s and clearly attempts to counter negative perceptions around working conditions in clothing factories. Clothing factory jobs were not glamorous or well paid, and many former workers who were interviewed for this research spoke of the hard work, the monotony, the pressure of the time clock system, and of keeping up with the speed of the conveyors. But without exception, they all spoke with pride of their skills as machinists, their abilities to operate any machine put in front of them and produce high quality work. Jill, a former employee of lingerie manufacturer La Mode in Morwell, even brought a sample of her work from 60 years earlier to our interview. She carefully unwrapped a delicately appliqued lady's slip of artificial silk and lace. Former employee of Toronto Fashions in West Footscray, Marion, described management's timing of each operation and how a fast machinist could earn incentive bonuses for completing more than the expected number of operations. In some factories, workers were pitted against each other, and competitions to break each other's speed records were very much encouraged. From the workers' perspective, industry labour shortages were a plus, as it meant that they could pick and choose and come and go from paid employment at whim. Experienced machinists could walk straight into a job throughout most of the 1960s and 70s. And this flexibility suited many who left and returned throughout the years of having children. Former machinist Helen can't recall how many times she resigned from Dowd's for a variety of reasons over a 10-year period, being immediately rehired whenever she chose to return. All of my interviewees recalled similar experiences, with Marion recounting the story of resigning from Toronto Fashions and heading into the CBD for a job interview in the Manchester Unity building, then home to a myriad of small rag trade businesses and workrooms. Marion became lost in the corridors of this large building and knocked on the door of Captive Clothing to ask for directions. Marion never made it to the original interview, with captive clothing, literally capturing her on the spot with a better offer that utilised her design abilities as well as her machine experience. While machinists could walk straight onto the factory floor, the dire need for workers meant that many of those hired were unskilled raw recruits. From the employer's perspective, training, retraining and upskilling was a constant drain on time and resources and an expense that underscored profitability. Jill, who followed her two sisters into a job at La Mode in Morwell, described La Mode's training school that was in a separate area of the factory, catering for around 30 new recruits learning the ropes at any one time. Other workers described factory practices where rookies would be trained on the factory floor by ever-present, watchful supervisors. These stories collectively speak to the low tide on the labour pool that the industry operated within. Not only was constant training a drain on finances and human resources, but it also impacted production efficiency. And while this is impossible to quantify in monetary terms from the available sources, there is no doubt that high labour turnover and the endemic labour shortages placed a significant impost on the industry over time, making it appear weak and inefficient next to the highly organised and competitive manufacturers beginning to flex their muscles from within the cheap labour economies of the developing world. So when tariffs were reduced by 25% in 1973 as the first step of Australia's entry into the globalising world, clothing manufacturing here was already coming apart at the seams. A plethora of small factories scattered throughout Victoria was making small runs of uneconomical stock in understaffed premises. Any economies of scale that might have been achievable in manufacturing for Australia's expanding domestic market, which was still small by international standards, had been sabotaged by the younging of the market. Jean Shrimpton dared to be different in her miniskirt at Flemington in 1965, and young people around Australia hastened to follow in her footsteps. The quest for individualism through fashion segmented the market, and rather than strengthening local manufacture, it resulted in splintered production and the geographic spread of the industry into unsustainable settings. Of the companies studied for this research, Dowd survived into the 21st century with sheer determination and grit, clinging steadfastly to the ideal of Australian manufacture. Not without a few hiccups along the way, Dowds supplemented their production of fashion outerwear via savvy business decisions. Their market research into clothing sizes in the early 80s suggested that consumers were calling for fashion in larger sizes than the traditional size range of 8 to 14. Reaching out to former model and celebrity Maggie Tabberer resulted in the launch of the Maggie T range of fashions for larger sizes, catering to the Youthquake generation 2 decades on. And then in response to the expanding corporate world of the 1980s, Dowd Corporate manufactured fashion uniforms for many large clients, including ANZ Bank and Australia Post. But others who did not have the resources or entrepreneurial drive to diversify were not so lucky. The remaining 2 companies studied tell different stories. Prestige was taken over by Dunlop Australia in 1968, and its story is now enmeshed into the history of multinational Pacific brands. Latouth and Khalil sadly went into receivership in the early 1980s after a century of manufacturing in Victoria. Their fate followed the path of many other manufacturers that could not hang on, as retailers and designers progressively turned their back on local production throughout the 1970s and looked towards Asia for cheaper options. To close, here are some images of how changes in the built environment reflect the changing fortunes of the industry in the long term. Yakka purchased Dowd's corporate wear and took production offshore in the late 1990s. The Maggie Tea and the clothing company labels were sold in the early 2000s. But Dowd's former Warrigal factory still stands and was repurposed as a community health facility under the umbrella of West Gippsland Hospital and Healthcare Group. The building that was once the workplace of hundreds of local women in the second half of the 20th century now functions in a similar capacity again. But this time around, these Warrigal women are not making clothes for a demographic that's driving the younging of society, but they're in the employ of a rapidly growing health and services industry. Now facing the realities of ageing, the Youthquake generation is driving the growth of this industry too.
Thank you, Pauline. That was really fascinating.
Thank you, Katie.
It's so strange to think about copies of Jean Shrimpton's dress available just days afterwards. We think of that as such a modern fast fashion idea. Really fascinating.
Absolutely. They didn't waste any time in getting it in the windows.
Now, while Pauline takes a breath and you type your questions into the Q&A, I'll let you know about a few free talks coming up at the Old Treasury. On the 26th of October, you're invited to join us for, Printed on Stone, the lithographs of Charles Trudell. And on the 4th of November, we're beginning a new seminar series in partnership with the Australian Catholic University. Material Histories will begin with refugee objects. You can find details about both on our website, otb.org.au, and through our Eventbrite organisation page. Now, to the first question. Can you comment on the employment options for women after the collapse of manufacturing in the 1970s?
Yes, I can. It was really very difficult for a lot of women because a lot of the women employed, particularly in metropolitan areas, were migrant women, and a lot of people were under the restructuring incentives of the government, were encouraged for retraining. But I believe that a lot of migrant women whose command of English may not have been, totally up to speed were unable to sort of transition easily into other industries. In the country, for instance, there was a real lack of mobility among country women because a lot of them obviously had set down roots in the country areas where they were employed, they were married, they had families. So unless there was another industry opening in their country area, they had sort of very limited options. So a lot of them became unemployed.
Wow. So, the run-on effect of one thing is just amazing to think about.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Another question, just out of curiosity, have you done any research into Fletcher Jones and their demise from Warrnambool?
I haven't. I do know other scholars have looked at that, but yes, a very similar situation, I believe, although they were a different company model, so I probably best not comment on that.
Something for the future, perhaps.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, our usual perceptions of the 60s are as an area of rebellion, activism, and sort of counterculture beginnings. Do you think that had any influence on the fashion scene?
Yes, I think it did. Youth rebellion and sort of anti-establishment activism and the counterculture are some of the sort of more memorable aspects of the 1960s, and they've been quite perpetuated in the collective memory. Because of their very visibility, or their, the fact that they were well reported and they've actually been extensively discussed in the historical literature since then. But archival research and oral history testimony are actually showing that those, mainstream youth did not participate in activism and student rebellion and the counterculture. That was someone else's 1960s reality. It certainly did happen, but it was the minority. The majority of 1960s youth were busily working 9 to 5, probably no time to be protesting and, you know, making scenes in places. But most definitely, I would say that the widespread protest and rebellion certainly emboldened mainstream youth to use fashion as their, you know, little form of rebellion. So to actually mark your territory and draw a line in the sand between you and the oldies, you know, your parents, the people who'd, you know, gone through the war years and had a different outlook on life. Wearing, you know, the latest groovy clothes and pushing the boundaries was their form of, I suppose you could call it, soft rebellion.
Yeah. And, you know, we think of today of what we wear as sort of, it's presenting our individualism to the world. Yeah. We're an anti-uniform society in a way.
Yes, yes.
You've spoken about the changes in female fashion in the 1960s, but was there any similar changes in male fashion as well?
There were. And why my focus is on female fashion is the companies that I've chosen to study were manufacturers of female fashion. But most definitely, men's fashion sort of underwent a colourful revolution, I suppose you'd say. Drab and conservative colours were the sort of the fashion of the 50s and early 60s, and then once all the latest new styles were sort of coming out for women, men really did get in on the act as well, and bright colours, patterns, stripes in shirts. I believe the Beatles influenced a lot of male fashion in, I think, collarless jackets and shirts, and I think they had very skinny pants and ties and things like that. So some fashion historians who have studied male fashion call this era the Peacock Revolution, and I think that's a really great analogy.
A beautiful visual as well.
Yeah, true.
Can you speak to more about the deregulation of industry via outwork impact on the shifts you describe, and how has the practice changed over time?
Look, the effect on outwork is something that is really unknown. We do know that outwork had been occurring for decades and decades. It's nothing new. When things started to sort of go a bit pear-shaped after the 70s, when industry restructuring had sort of commenced, a lot of small maker-uppers were the ones who did go under first, and they were the ones who were also contracting out to outworkers. So it is a really, really difficult area, and everything, all the statistics that are mentioned are really only guesstimates, literally guesses. We just don't know.
Wow, it sounds like there's a lot of study for you to do.
I think that might be a dead end, though. To be honest, I just don't know where we would find out. I mean, we know that certain waves of immigration produced a lot of outworkers. I do know of people back in the early days of post-war immigration, a lot of migrant women, particularly from the southern European countries, did do outwork. Lots of them, of course, worked in the factories and were counted in the normal numbers, but lots of them worked from home as well. There are lots of anecdotes relating to family members who lived next door to somebody who lived next door to a lady, and, you know, she used to make clothes from home. And then in the next sort of wave of immigration, the Asian wave of immigration in the sort of 70s, a lot of outwork happened there as well. And I think it still goes on, obviously.
Yeah. Have you looked much into other countries' responses at the same time?
To restructuring or to outwork, do you mean?
To to the whole thing, really, I guess, how other countries fared with the changes and...
Okay, basically speaking, the same as we did in the end. Yes, all industries, like there was quite a deindustrialization push, I suppose, or wave, and yeah, offshore, particularly to the developing economies, is where a lot of the manufacture went. So even though we now bemoan the fact, oh, we don't manufacture things in Australia anymore, it's the same in all what we class as developed countries. Not much is manufactured in Britain, very little in Canada, very little in America. It's all manufactured out of Asia. Yeah,
it's sad, but
and that's not just clothes, that's everything basically. And I mean, yes, there are some small clothing manufacturers still in Australia. Most of them are quite niche and artisanal, but nothing like the mainstream clothing manufacture that used to happen back in the 70s backwards.
Yeah. A couple more questions. Did the factories supply to suburban stores, or did women need to travel to the CBD to buy the latest styles?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. I suppose I haven't actually really studied the spread of retail. I do know that in the 1960s that Chadstone was the first main shopping centre outside of the strip shops, or, on the strips. So makes it sound like something, untoward there, doesn't it? the high street, I suppose you would say. Yeah, I would imagine that, that's something I honestly don't know, but I would imagine that a lot of the shops along the main roads, the strip shopping centres, would have been independent stores. So whether or not they participated in taking in the latest fashion, or whether it was mainly just in department stores, I don't know.
Yeah, you'd imagine the smaller stores would have to cater more to the people directly around them. So they might not have had the youth culture.
I don't think it would have taken very long for them to get it, though, but perhaps initially, maybe not.
And one last question. Could you comment on the design influences in Australian young people's fashion? Was there any sense of an Australian style that was driving what was being produced?
I believe that there were instances of things that were quite unique to Australia. In my sort of reading about different styles and influences, not that that is a major part of my thesis, because it's not the actual materiality of the clothes that I'm interested in, it's the production of them. But there were certain things that took off in Australia that were quite separate from the rest of the world. Like there was an instance of a particular love of Australians for brown corduroy, and apparently a lot of jeans, jackets, skirts, all sorts of things were made in brown corduroy that was just literally, devoured by Australian consumers, fashion consumers, and it wasn't happening elsewhere. So I suppose that's sort of something that's a little bit different. But when it comes to Australian designers, well, yes, they certainly started to make their mark more so in the 70s, when you had designers like Linda Jackson and Jenny Key, who would design sort of around Australiana sort of themes. I suppose they were ones that were particularly Australian. I wondered, though, whether the early 60s designers, Pruact and Norma Tullow, I think it was mainly, they were influenced very much by Mary Quant and what was happening in London. And London was really the sort of hothouse for 60s fashion. London influenced America and us, and I suppose all the other English-speaking countries too.
Definitely. Fascinating. Well, thank you, Pauline. That was really wonderful. And thank you to everyone who joined us in the discussion. It was, I think it was, we all got a great deal of information out of that, and very, very fascinating. A reminder to everyone watching that Melbourne Fashion Week is on till Sunday, and there's still plenty of interesting talks, runways and exhibitions to see. Our Lost Jobs, The Changing World of Work exhibition is available for free in the old Treasury building. Our opening hours are Sunday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m, or 24/7 on the website. And if you're looking for the new seminar series with ACU and OTB, I've put the link in the chat. It's also available at otb.org.au/MHSS. Thank you again, Pauline, and I hope those watching will join us on the 26th for Printed on Stone, the lithographs of Charles Trudell. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.